What's going on, guys? It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. This one I'm going to be going over my final league-winning players list. I'll be going over 10 players that I think have legitimate league-winning upside this season, and guys that I tend to find myself targeting in drafts quite a bit. I try to cover guys that across all different positions and across sort of all different spots in the draft, so whether that be early draft picks all the way into middle and later round draft picks, just so that you guys sort of have different guys that you can have in mind at each stage in your draft, depending on where you are in the draft order, depending upon what positions you're drafting as well. I wanted to have some players available for you guys to take a look at. So this will be my final league-winning players list. I have done some league-winning running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks videos. So those were early on in the offseason. If you do want to go take a look at those, there should be generally more players on that list, but this will be just sort of condensed into a couple players into each position, so I just have 10 sort of guys that I'm really actually targeting in every single draft right now. So yeah, really hope you guys find these videos useful. It's been a lot of fun making all these videos and definitely useful for me. I use these same lists that I'm putting out in drafts that I go into. These are all guys that I am personally trying to draft quite a bit, and it's been super exciting getting into draft seasons. I had several drafts last weekend. I've got a couple more this next weekend, and we're going to get right into football here soon. It's currently Wednesday, August 30th, so we've got 8 days till the first actual football game on Thursday night between the Lions and the Chiefs, and then we're going to be off and running. It's going to be a really fun season. So yeah, with that, let's just get into the first league-winning player here. So let's start off with the obvious one. I've got Chris Olave here. You guys probably knew he'd make this list given just how much I've talked him up this season. Olave is just an absolute stud going into the 2-3 turn this season. He's got a legitimate shot in my eyes to finish as a top 5 wide receiver. In fact, I do think the wide receiver 1 overall is actually in his range of outcomes this season. I'm far more or just extremely comfortable drafting him as my wide receiver 1 in drafts. If you're picking early on in the draft, you even want to go running back to start. Maybe you want to go running back, quarterback, running back, tight end, maybe take Andrews at the end of the second, and then draft Chris Olave there. I think it's totally fine. If he's your wide receiver 1, you can still have a really quality wide receiver room around that. If the Saints are any better on offense, any pass heavier than we have been in the past, which is not what I'm actually projecting out of them this season. I'm projecting them to be a pretty balanced offense, a team that should just be a little bit more efficient than they were last season with the upgraded quarterback. And if they actually just aired out quite a bit more, there's real upside beyond where I have Olave projected, and that's projected him as the wide receiver 7 right now. I think there's going to be a ton of spike weeks as well, just given how prolific of a deep threat Olave is. There are going to be several weeks throughout the course of the season where Chris Olave is going to just absolutely win you your week on his own. The Saints have the easiest strength of schedule in terms of points given up to wide receivers last season, going into the 2023 season here, so there are going to be a lot of great matchups to go for Chris Olave, and on top of that, the fantasy playoffs line up quite nicely for him. He gets 3 really nice matchups. He's got the Giants in Week 15, who aren't exactly fantastic. They're generally like a middle-of-the-pack defense to go against for wide receivers, but then after that, he's got the Rams and the Bucks, 2 teams that are really going to struggle quite a bit to defend the pass this year and are going to be really great matchups for you guys to take advantage of. So I know it's a little bit silly to be looking at playoff matchups at this early in the season. We really don't know exactly what the defenses are going to look like come Week 15, Week 16, but it's just really a good indicator to see that there is a real potential here for Chris Olave to have some really monster weeks in the fantasy playoffs as well. Next up, the first running back on this list is going to be Nick Chubb. I've said many times all offseason that I think Nick Chubb can legitimately finish as the running back 1 overall in fantasy, and I still stand by that. He's one of the few remaining true workhorse running backs in the NFL. It's sort of become a dying breed. You could really argue that Josh Jacobs, and Derrick Henry are the only true workhorse running backs left in the NFL. If you want to throw guys, I guess Saquon as well belongs on that list, but you could also throw Jonathan Taylor on there if he's actually involved in the offense, gets back in Indianapolis, but there's definitely less than 10 of them. There's really few of them at this point in the NFL. Nick Chubb's one of the more talented ones as well. I think he's more talented than Josh Jacobs. I think he's more talented of a runner than Saquon Barkley. Probably more talented at this stage in their career than Derrick Henry. So there's really not much to be concerned about with Nick Chubb, given that of all those running backs I mentioned, I do think Nick Chubb is going to be the only workhorse running back on a team that I would expect to be a top 10 offense in the NFL this season. On top of that, with the absence of Kareem Hunt and D'Ernest Johnson as well, there's a legitimate shot here for Nick Chubb to post career highs in targets and receptions this season. If he could add even 40 receptions to his profile this season, that would give him a ton of upside. We already know that Nick Chubb does have that 2,000 rushing yard, 20 rushing touchdown upside in his range of outcomes. He's the guy that could legitimately lead the league in rushing. I do think that a 2,000 yard rushing season is within his range of outcomes, just given how we could see a season where he averages 6 yards per carry against 24 carries a game. On top of that, if this offense is any better, those touchdown numbers should go up as well. It's been a little bit frustrating rostering Nick Chubb the last couple years because they didn't necessarily just guarantee him the goal line work. If Kareem Hunt was in on offense, Kareem Hunt got to stay in on the goal line, and that did cap his touchdown upside, but that's gone as well this season. So even if he does still lose passing work a little bit to a guy like Jerome Ford, I think it's pretty safe to say that this goal line work is going to go strictly to Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb is probably going to post near career highs in touchdowns as well this season. And His starts in the fantasy playoffs are really great as well. His week 15 and 16 matchups are against Chicago and then Houston. Those are two extremely abusable defenses. I think you could see a scenario where Nick Chubb posts like 350 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns over those 2 weeks, and he could easily be a guy that just sort of carries rosters into the fantasy championship and really be a guy that's going to help you guys win your leagues this season. So I love drafting Nick Chubb at like the end of round 1, beginning of round 2. He's a guy that I think can legitimately be a guy that really will just be a significant difference maker for you guys this season, and I think it's reasonable to say he's going to have a career year this year. Next up, the first and I think only tight end on this list is going to be Mark Andrews. Andrews has a legitimate shot in my eyes to finish close to what Travis Kelce is going to give you from a production standpoint, and he comes at a significant discount going at really the end of round 3, it seems like lately. The Ravens are going to be an extremely pass-heavy offense, at least in theory, and in the past few seasons, Mark Andrews has been a top 2 tight end in what was a far lower passing volume offense, a much slower paced offense, and an offense that really didn't utilize just the passing game as much as I'm expecting them to. I think that 100 receptions, 1,200 yards, 10 receiving touchdowns is certainly in the range of outcomes for Mark Andrews this season, and he really doesn't have to compete with anybody for targets that's that dominant. I think Zay Flowers is likely the largest competition for targets he's going to see this season. I know you could argue that he has a little bit more competition in the wide receiver room between Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, and Odell Beckham Jr., but I don't really think anything's going to happen with Odell Beckham Jr. I don't think he's going to produce much this season. Rashad Bateman's been injured all offseason, and we really don't want to guarantee any sort of thing. I just have a hard time expecting much out of Rashad Bateman this season, and I think that the season where Mark Andrews was the wide receiver 1, or tight end 1 just 2 seasons ago, we saw Marquise Brown post really high quality numbers as well, and I don't even expect Zay Flowers to put up those kinds of numbers. So I think that you could see a scenario where Mark Andrews actually ends up with like a 28, 29% target share in an offense that throws the ball 600, 550 to 600 times this season, and that'd be a big upgrade from what we saw last season. That could easily give him 200 targets is certainly in the range of outcomes for him. I wouldn't expect that by any means, but you could see a guy get 160, 170 targets. That'd be like 10 targets a week. That's going to give him a ton of volume, and he's a really talented player. 30 touchdowns is in the range of outcomes for Lamar Jackson this season, and they've got a really favorable schedule as well. Their playoff schedule, they play the Jacksonville Jaguars, San Francisco 49ers, and Miami Dolphins. All 3 are teams that really do give up quite a few points to the tight end position, and over the entire course of the season, they've got the 3rd easiest schedule for tight ends as well. That's another just sort of feather in his cap that he's not going to really be facing very many defenses that are really good at focusing in on the tight ends. He's going to be a monster this season. I love drafting him in the 3rd round, and it's part of why I really don't find myself drafting Travis Kelce that often either. Next, we've got the first quarterback on this list, probably a guy that you guys were expecting to end up on this list, and that's Justin Herbert. I think that Justin Herbert's got a legitimate shot to finish as the quarterback 1 overall in fantasy this season. He's got a legitimately elite offensive coordinator. His weapons are just insane. He's got Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, first-round pick, and Quentin Johnston. Joshua Palmer is a really capable 4th wide receiver. Jalen Guyton even's going to come back after about 4 weeks this season. Gerald Everett's a really explosive tight end, and Austin Eckler's obviously one of the more explosive pass-catching running backs in the NFL. And he's also fully healthy this season. He broke his ribs last season. Wasn't really able to throw the ball downfield as much as he'd like to. Didn't really have any ability to offer you a rushing floor as well. And Rashawn Slater, their all-pro left tackle, he got hurt last season. Really just impacted the offensive line in a negative way. They weren't able to stretch the field the way they'd like to, and the way that Kellen Moore is going to want to as their new offensive coordinator. The offensive line is healthy. This is going to be a scenario where you're going to have a team that's probably going to throw the ball 40-plus times a game this season. Could easily see 700 total pass attempts on the season, and a lot of those are going to be really deep downfield, and they've got the guys to do it. Keenan Allen's a more than capable pass catcher over the middle of the field, even 15, 20 yards deep, and then we know what kind of deep threats Mike Williams and Quentin Johnston are. This is going to be a team that's going to do a ton of airing it out this season, and on top of that, Justin Herbert can add legitimate rushing floor as well. He had like 300 rushing yards per season over his first 2 seasons in the NFL. We just didn't really see that last year because of the rib injury, and I think that's something that we're going to see sort of revert back to the mean here. On top of all that, the Chargers have the 5th easiest strength of schedule for the quarterback position, and their first 4 weeks are just absolutely fantastic. You're going to get off to a really nice start with Justin Herbert. He gets to start the season up against Miami, Tennessee, Minnesota, and Las Vegas, all 4 teams that gave up points in the top 10 to quarterbacks last season. These are teams that have pretty mediocre to bad defenses, especially against the pass, and at least 3 of them in Miami, Minnesota, and Las Vegas are going to be capable offenses as well. You could see a scenario where he gets into quite a few shootouts. The only knock that you could maybe give him is that his playoff schedule is a little bit tougher. Las Vegas in Week 15 is quite good, but then he goes Buffalo and Denver, two generally pretty good defenses. But I think this is a scenario where both of those games end up being shootouts. And in general, at this stage in the NFL, when a really good offense beats a really good defense, I tend to just believe that the offenses are going to win out. The Bills and Denver Broncos should have decent offenses here, and I think we'll probably just see a shootout in both of those games as well. So Herbert's got a really great playoff schedule in my eyes. His strength of schedule over the course of the whole season is great, and really just everything's lined up for Justin Herbert to post a massive season. I think that you could see a world where he has 5,000, 5,500 passing yards this season, adds a few hundred rushing yards, a couple of rushing touchdowns, and I think 50 passing touchdowns is a legitimate possibility for him. He could be a guy that finishes with 55 to 60 touchdowns in total on the season, and honestly, the kind of guy that you're gonna remember for a few years. This being the year that you had Justin Herbert on your roster. Next up, we've got another guy that I hope you're not surprised made this list, and that's going to be David Montgomery. He's going to be a vital part of the Lions offense that honestly is in need of weapons on the team, given that they really only have Amon-Ra, Jahmyr Gibbs, and David Montgomery, especially while we have Jameson Williams suspended for the first 6 games. I think Sam Laporta is a capable tight end, but he's a rookie. It's hard to expect too much high-end, reliable production out of him. And guys like Josh Reynolds and stuff, or Marvin Jones, are capable wide receivers, but nobody that you're going to want to sort of center your offense around. This offense is going to run through Montgomery, Gibbs, and Amon-Ra. And David Montgomery is just a much more talented running back than what Jamal Williams is at this point in their careers, and that's especially in the passing game. David Montgomery is a very capable pass catcher, and that's not something that we saw the Lions utilize Jamal Williams for last season. Despite all of that, Jamal Williams managed to finish as a top 10 running back in fantasy last season, albeit on the back of 17 rushing touchdowns. That is not something that I'm expecting David Montgomery to put up this season, but I think it's legitimately possible that we could see him put up over 1,000 rushing yards and over 10 rushing touchdowns this season. I think he's going to be a much more efficient runner than what we saw out of Jamal Williams, and then on top of that, I think he's a capable goal line back, a guy that could still easily bruise his way into that double-digit touchdown range. On top of that, the Lions' offensive line is just legitimately great, and like I said, there's only really 3 players this offense can run through. On top of that, after final roster cuts, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are the only 2 running backs left on this roster. There is no concern at all about a third running back coming in and potentially stealing even a couple snaps here and there, and Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get utilized in the slot quite a bit as well. That means that David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs might just both be on the field for 80-90% of snaps this season, and on top of that, this Lions have the second easiest strength of schedule at the running back position this season. This comes on the heels of a season where their backfield scored more points than any other backfield in the NFL. I think Monty's got a legitimate shot to finish as a running back 1 this season. I think that he and Gibbs could both legitimately do that. They're both really talented players. They've got different skill sets that's going to sort of allow them both to see the field at the same time, and this is going to be a really good offense as well. So I love the value of both of these guys, but I think that David Montgomery's just got the better value because he's going like 4 rounds later, and he's a guy that could legitimately be a top 15, top 10 running back this year and not cost you that much at all. Next up, we've got our first rookie on this list, and that's going to be Jordan Addison. I think Jordan Addison is just ready-made for the NFL and could legitimately have a pretty immediate impact for the Minnesota Vikings on the NFL field. He's an elite route runner. He's just ready to play at an NFL level at this point in his career. He's also taking over in a role that allowed Adam Thielen to run the second most routes in the entire NFL last season. I think it's fair to say that at this point in their careers, you have a 31, 32-year-old Adam Thielen last season who was just unable to separate. He was near the bottom of all the metrics in terms of his ability to gain separation. At this point, Adam Thielen is just not as talented of a wide receiver as Jordan Addison. I think that's a fair thing to say, and Jordan Addison's going to obviously be taking over that role, given that he was drafted to sort of fill the void that was left by Thielen going to Carolina this season. On top of that, TJ Hawkinson's dealing with a mixture of injuries. He had an ear infection all training camp. He's now got lower back stiffness. There's rumors that he could be just working to try and get more money on his contract now that this is his final year. And with that being said, I think that really does open up some door for Jordan Addison to finish as the number 2 target on this offense. I think that especially over the latter half of the season where you see Jordan Addison and generally rookies in general just sort of come into their own, Addison could be the number 2 target in this offense. The Vikings have the 9th easiest strength of schedule over the second half of the season, and that is when I like to see rookies start panning out. They do have a really late bye as well, right before the fantasy playoffs. Their bye is in week 13, so right after that bye as well is when we often see rookies take an even further step in involvement in their offense. That's going to mean that Jordan Addison's going to come into the fantasy playoffs, come into week 14, give you a really quality week, and then give you 3 more weeks of extremely high involvement. On top of that, I think we could just see Addison post legitimately top 15 numbers over the second half of the season. I think that this could be a scenario where come next season we're talking about Jordan Addison in the same realm with those guys like T. Higgins, Chris Olave, T. Higgins, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, guys that are elite wide receiver 2s on their team in high passing volume offenses and just happen to be wide receiver 2s because their receiver ahead of them happens to be a superstar. I don't think Jordan Addison is good enough to end up overtaking that role of being like a superstar on his team. I don't think he's going to be a Justin Jefferson. I don't think he'll be a Jamar Chase, but I think he's good enough to be as good as a Devonta Smith or a T. Higgins. And this is a Vikings passing offense that's quite good. They could easily throw for 5,000 yards this season. They're going to be extremely pass heavy, and I think Addison could be legitimately in that conversation with those other high-end elite wide receiver twos for high passing volume teams, and being able to get him in like the 7th, 8th, even 9th round sometimes is just way too juicy for me. He's a guy that I love drafting, especially if he's my 3rd or 4th wide receiver, a guy that I can sort of put on my bench and wait to see while he starts panning out, and over the second half of the season, he's going to be a guy that's really going to help take your team the rest of the way. Next up, we've got a guy that I'm sort of finally coming around on this offseason, and that's J.K. Dobbins. I've sort of been a little bit below ADP on him for most of the offseason. I'd been concerned with the holdout, I'd been concerned with the injury, and I'd been concerned in general with this Ravens offense just being too pass-heavy. But more and more, I think this Ravens offense is just going to be a lot more fast-paced in general, and that's going to allow there to be potentially even more rushing attempts up for grabs for J.K. Dobbins. On top of that, we've really heard very little about the other running backs in this backfield. Gus Edwards has gotten very little noise out of training camp. There's been a little bit of talk about Justice Hill flashing some at training camp, but this is J.K. Dobbins' backfield. He's probably going to get 60 to 70% of the touches in the backfield, and Todd Monken's historically utilized his running backs as pass catchers quite a bit out of the backfield. J.K. Dobbins is a perfectly capable pass catcher as well. I know it was several years ago in college, but he was a very reliable receiver back in his college days, and I think he's got that skill set, and if he could be utilized as a pass catcher even any more than he was earlier on in his career, I think we could be talking about, like, let's say 25 to 30 receptions, nothing crazy, but enough to sort of give him a little bit of a bump. On top of that, Dobbins has already shown that he can score touchdowns at a high level in the NFL. He had 9 touchdowns and only 134 carries as a rookie. I think you could easily see a scenario where he finishes with 250 to 300 carries this season, and that would mean he's got a legitimate shot at 15 rushing touchdowns. I wouldn't expect that, but I think double-digit touchdowns is a pretty reasonable projection if he ends up getting that full workload. And on top of that, he's going to be back to full health this season. This will be his 2nd year removed from that ACL injury. That is normally when we see running backs start coming back to full form. That 2nd year is when we do start seeing these guys really just sort of emerge as that fully healthy self. And despite being less than 100% last season, he averaged 5.7 yards per carry. He averaged 6 yards per carry as a rookie. The dude is just a really talented runner. Lamar Jackson's going to open up a lot of extra holes for the running backs in this offense, and there's going to be a lot of room for J.K. Dobbins to succeed, especially if this passing offense can take a step forward and sort of take pressure off of the running game as well in Baltimore. On top of that, the Ravens have the 5th easiest strength of schedule against for running backs this season, so you're not going to be worried about defensive matchups too much. And on top of that, you get a beautiful Week 1 matchup against the worst ranked team against running backs last season, the Houston Texans. It's going to be a really great start to the season for J.K. Dobbins. If you draft J.K. Dobbins, you can just thank me for your 1-0 start already. He's going to be a really great asset for you guys in the early going. So now digging a little bit deeper, I'm going to go with Tank Bigsby as another potentially league-winning asset. I know that Bigsby is likely not going to see enough work to be a league winner unless there's an injury that happens to Travis Etienne, but Tank Bigsby is going to see meaningful work and meaningful snaps and touches on an offense that's going to be a really high-end offense this season, an offense that I expect to be top 5 to top 10, and that's going to happen even without an injury to Travis Etienne. Bigsby is just the bigger back. He's going to be utilized near the goal line quite a bit. I think we could see him steal quite a few of the pass-catching snaps as well from Travis Etienne, and if Etienne were to go down, Tank Bigsby has more of that workhorse build. He's got that body type where I think you could actually see him take on a full workhorse load, and if that were the case, you'd see a guy getting 20 to 25 touches in what should be a top 10 offense in the NFL, a team that I fully expect to take a step forward this season. Trevor Lawrence is going to take that step forward. They've added Calvin Ridley. This is going to be an offense that's going to score a ton of points this season. There's going to be a ton of touchdown upside. I think you could legitimately see Tank Bigsby score 10 touchdowns this season, even without an injury happening to Travis Etienne. That's why I think you could see a world where Bigsby just outscores what Etienne does even without an injury. It's think sort of like Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift last season, where DeAndre Swift just wasn't given that full allotment of snaps because they were worried about a potential injury, worried about that durability, and then Jamal Williams got all the goal line work. I think that range of outcomes exists for Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne in this backfield, and if an injury were to occur to Etienne, who, let's be honest, he has already missed an entire season in his NFL career due to injury, so we know that's certainly a possible outcome for Travis Etienne. If that were to happen, you would have Tank Bigsby being honestly a top 10 running back going forward. You could even make an argument for him to be ranked even higher than that. And you're drafting him in the 14th round. He's a guy that you can play in your flex without an injury happening to him. And if an injury were to happen to Travis Etienne, which we're obviously never rooting for, we want everybody to stay healthy, but you've got a scenario there where Tank Bigsby would immediately be a top 10 running back and be a guy that you can start every single week and be a legitimate league-winning asset for you. So sticking with players that are going pretty late in drafts, I want to talk about Quentin Johnston as well, another rookie that made this list. I think he's definitely going to start slow this season. He's probably going to even start week 1 as the number 4 wide receiver on this offense. We saw Joshua Palmer get plenty of work in the offense, be a guy that we saw be really useful for the Chargers last season, and be a guy that, honestly, he got most of the preseason off while Quentin Johnston played in most of the preseason games here. I think Quentin Johnston, though, is just a far more talented player than Joshua Palmer. It's a pretty safe bet that he will overtake Joshua Palmer by the end of the season as the wide receiver 3 in this offense, and it's also a pretty safe bet that at some point this season we're going to see Keenan Allen or Mike Williams miss time. If that's the case, then we're going to see a scenario where Quentin Johnston becomes the number 2, maybe the number 1 most targeted player in an offense that's just going to be extremely efficient this season. In those games where Quentin Johnston happens to be the number 2 wide receiver in the offense, I think he'd be a legitimate top 20 option at the wide receiver position. He'd have legitimate top 10 weekly ceiling because of how explosive he is, how much they're going to utilize him downfield, and how, just like I said, how efficient and how explosive I think this Chargers offense can be. I think they're going to score 30 points every single week and be an offense that's probably going to have 3 passing touchdowns a game. You could see a scenario where there'll be several weeks this season where you'll see Quentin Johnston go for 102. And the Chargers have the 10th easiest strength of schedule for the wide receiver position. Johnston is going to be on the field pretty much all the time over the second half of the season. Like I said, I think it's safe to say he will overtake Joshua Palmer as that number 3 wide receiver on the team. It'd be silly for the Chargers to not run 3 wide receiver sets with the trio of wide receivers they have, and that's going to be what they'll do. They'll run 3 wide receiver sets with Everett and Eckler on the field quite a bit. They're going to really push the ball downfield, and Johnston's going to be a guy that's really going to sort of come into his own over the second half of the season. He's just a legitimately good player. He's got a legitimately elite quarterback in the NFL, and he's a guy that's going to have a really nice role in a really high-end offense. He doesn't cost you that much. He's the cheapest of like the 4 first-round rookies between him, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, and JSN. I think he's still going to have a plenty high ceiling. I think you could make the argument that he even has a higher ceiling than guys like Zay Flowers, just because I think the offense could be a little bit better, especially more pass-heavy. And last, I wanted to put one more rookie on here, one more quarterback, and that's going to be Anthony Richardson for me, who I do think has legitimate league-winning upside. I think he's a guy that, although I'm not confident is going to happen, I'm still not confident he's going to pan out as like an elite NFL quarterback or even a franchise quarterback at the NFL level. I think it's tough to argue that he doesn't have legit top 5 upside at the quarterback position, especially over the second half of the season. Without Jonathan Taylor as a part of this team, I know a lot of people are worried that we could see this offense really struggle, but I think the offense is going to struggle as a whole regardless. But what taking Jonathan Taylor off the roster really would do is it would mean that Anthony Richardson is given all of the goal line work, whether they throw or pat or run the ball. This offense will score. If the offense scores, it will be Anthony Richardson who ends up in the end zone one way or another, and that's going to give him a legitimate shot at 1,000 rushing yards, legitimate shot at 10 rushing touchdowns as well. And if you put up those numbers on a rushing standpoint, it makes it really hard for you to not be a meaningful fantasy contributor, pretty much regardless of how well you perform through the air. There are obviously going to be some very significant ups and downs with Anthony Richardson. He's a very raw passer. He's probably going to turn the ball over 20 times this season, be a guy that's going to make a lot of mistakes, but that means you're going to have the Colts in catch-up mode quite a bit this season. I think they're going to let Anthony Richardson play through those mistakes and sort of let him play free. They are in an offense using the offensive. Their head coach is the offensive coordinator from the Philadelphia Eagles last season. We saw how well they utilized the mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts last year, and I'm not saying that Anthony Richardson is nearly capable of what Jalen Hurts is. I don't think he's as talented of a passer by any means, but we're going to see them really try to utilize that rushing ability of Anthony Richardson. He'll probably get 10 rushing attempts a game, and that's probably going to give him 1,100, 1,200 rushing yards on the season, and that's going to make him a top 10 fantasy quarterback regardless of what he does through the air. And over the second half of the season, I think we could really see him come into his own. They've also got a really solid fantasy playoff schedule against teams like Pittsburgh, Atlanta, and Las Vegas. Las Vegas in Week 17 is fantastic for your fantasy playoffs. I don't think you want to roll into your Week 1 with him as your starting quarterback. I think it's going to be a really bumpy ride, and you're definitely going to want to see what happens. But stashing him on your bench and waiting could legitimately be a thing that will be extremely fruitful for you over the second half of the season. I know a lot of teams last season were extremely successful by sort of drafting a guy like Kirk Cousins and then taking Justin Fields really late and then just sort of waiting until Justin Fields broke out and allowed them to sort of ride him to a high-quality finish in their fantasy leagues. I think this could be a really similar situation. I like taking Anthony Richardson as my first quarterback, then taking a safer guy, a guy like Kirk Cousins, a guy like Geno Smith, a guy like Jared Goff, and playing that sort of streaming caliber guy every single week until we see Anthony Richardson take that step forward, and then let Anthony Richardson be the guy that's really going to help take your roster over the top over the second half of the season if he starts panning out. So I'm not confident that's going to happen, but it's tough to deny that he has that upside. Anthony Richardson could legitimately be a top 5 quarterback over the second half of the season, and if things go well for him, I do think he's got the weapons behind him with Pittman, Josh Downs, and Alec Pierce, and he's got the rushing upside to really make that happen with the right coaching staff. So I think he's definitely worth a flyer. He's currently going as the 15th quarterback off the board at like pick 107. I think that's perfectly reasonable place to be drafting him. He's a really great like low-end quarterback one, high upside, high risk kind of guy, and a guy that I'm happy to have on my roster and do think has legitimately winning upside this year. So that'll do it for my final league-winning upside, or players with league-winning upside video. These are all guys that I do have in a lot of my rosters, guys that I do think have legitimate opportunities to be significantly more valuable than where you're drafting them this season. I think there is a lot of risk associated with several of them, although some of them I think are pretty safe draft picks as well. I just think that if these guys hit the way that we think they can, these are definitely guys that could really help take your fantasy team over the edge. And obviously that's what we're playing for. We're not playing to get third or fourth in our fantasy leagues. We definitely are playing this year and every year just to try and get first. I don't necessarily prescribe to that if you're not first, your last belief, because I think a lot of fantasy football does end up being a little bit of luck. You want to get into the playoffs every single year, make sure that you're not sort of going all in on risk players, but I think you definitely want to take a little bit of that hybrid approach, make sure that you're getting some players with a lot of volatility, a lot of upside, and then some other safer players to sort of make sure that you can do everything you can to make your way into the playoffs, and then sort of find your way to manufacture wins throughout that as well. But I really hope you guys are finding these videos useful. I may have a ton of fun making them. It's definitely really useful for me in terms of doing my fantasy draft prep as well, seeing which guys I believe have that upside. And that's really helping me sort of come to terms with my beliefs as well. Having to sort of explain them like this does help me sort of either gain confidence, or maybe I have to move a player off of these lists because I don't actually see it. For example, a player that I was going to include on this list was going to be JOHNSTON, and I couldn't actually bring myself to put him on the list because looking at their schedule this season, I didn't really see a world where JOHNSTON finishes like a top 15 wide receiver, especially given that he's probably going to be splitting targets too much with Terry McLaurin. I still think JOHNSTON's a really great draft pick, but having to try and find a way to explain how I think he had a league-winning upside, I didn't really see it, so it really helps me sort of decipher which players I think have those range of outcomes, and sort of just really fun for me as well. Up next, I'll be doing a video where I go over this year's versions of last year's storylines. I'll be talking about guys like Josh Jacobs last year, trying to find that version this year. The Denver Broncos last year, trying to find that version of this year's team. Things like that, sort of trying to sort of use with a path to sort of project the future and sort of see which players I think are going to be good predictors of what we saw last season versus this season. So if you guys want to get that video, please do subscribe to the channel. You can click the notification bell so you get a notification when a new video comes out. There will be a video that comes out every single day throughout the course of the rest of the off season. Once we get into the regular season as well, there will be several videos a week. I'll be here all season long to help you guys win your leagues. I really want to help grow the community and help as many people win their leagues as possible. Like I said, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. We're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by the start of the NFL season. We've been moving up really quickly lately. We're at like 760 something right now with 8 days to spare, so we'd have to make a hell of a push. We need like 30 a day to get there by the start of the NFL season, so probably won't happen, but if we can do it, it'd be super cool. It would be a really fun milestone to hit, and I really do appreciate all the support we're getting. So if you've subscribed to the channel already, please do just give the video a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm, helps me know that I'm doing a good job, and helps me know that you want to see more content like this. So yeah, with that, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.